Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Coffee with the Critters, where we live stream every Sunday morning at 9 a.m. Eastern, unless our travel schedule deems otherwise. And we've been doing this every Sunday morning here on the Animal Behavior Center's Facebook page for coming up in March, it'll be 5 years. So I will never run out of topics and never run out of guests to have on. And today we have a returning guest based on his education, his content, his experience, and past reviews people have given when I've had Jim on here before. Great reviews. So I've asked him to come back on today and discuss a topic which is I think greatly overlooked, misunderstood, but we'll talk about that more as soon as I bring Jim Gillies on here with us in just a minute. Good morning, Jeannie. Good morning, Therese, Steve, Patricia, Helen. Good morning, everybody. Hope everybody is having a great holiday season. But let's go ahead and get started because we have a lot of content I want to share with you today. For those that may be new, my name is Lara Joseph, owner of the Animal Behavior Center. We're an international educational center where we empower animals and the people that care for them. And we do that through our live streaming services and through the content and education in applied behavior analysis and positive reinforcement training. Good morning, Bobby. Hey, Carol. So for people that may be new, if you want to find out more about the work we do, you can always take a look at our website, theanimalbehaviorcenter.com. If you need to get in touch with me directly, I answer all my own emails. And you can email me at Lara, Lara, at theanimalbehaviorcenter.com. So just to do, hey, Marie. Just to do a little bit of a recap of this past week, which I try to do, we do have some new critters coming to the center for training. But if you want to also join our email newsletter list, you can do that here on our Facebook page. Also take a look at our events page here on the Animal Behavior Center's Facebook page. I try to always post upcoming live streams, workshops, events we have here. I do get behind on doing this, but they are always there. Next week, we'll be on here with Director of Operations, Laura Zitzelberger from Nature's Nursery. The following week, which is the week before Christmas, I'll be doing another live stream on enrichment where we show how we make enrichment and incorporate it into our behavior modification plans with the numerous different species of animals we work with. People have been sending us, if they are selling products, they are sending us products for our review, and we will be reviewing a few of those products on the next, in Coffee with Critters in 2 weeks. So pay attention to our events page here on the Animal Behavior Center's Facebook page. Here's our website if you want to find out more of the services we do. Like I said, we do have workshops, and a lot of our services are live streamed from here or different organizations we work with. I was just talking to Jim about this right before the broadcast started. Every Saturday morning, I try to post this graphic that says, how well do you know the Animal Behavior Center? And I am here it's fun, and it's hard for me to kind of come up with, okay, how do I test to see how well people know? But a lot of people know the Animal Behavior Center very well, which is a compliment to the work we do here. So we appreciate you. A recap of this past week. It's been a busy week, been a lot of training, but the lemurs are thriving. We have moved on with them from crate training to harness training. We need to get them out of this cage. And this is why I always say, keep your animals used to change, because a lot of the animals I work with are undomestic or exotics. because I choose to do that to back up the great work of the professional dog trainers out there by showing how the laws of behavior cross species. So we have Dylan Pickles here, and keep them used to change, because the more they are not used to change, the more stress can be induced into their environment. And that's what we do here, is try to take the stress out of the environment. And we do that through applied behavior analysis and positive reinforcement. So one last thing I would say, this is what I've been working on, something else I've been working on all week. Studies show that one of the most complex forms of enrichment is social enrichment. And I agree. So we try to, and we do that social enrichment. We implement social enrichment through our training. And we also encourage other animals to interact with each other here. Same species, other animals. This is Rico and Coco. Rico is on the right, our 15-year-old umbrella cockatoo. Coco is on the left, our 35-year-old umbrella cockatoo. And I see a relationship there that can blossom. And I like animals interacting with each other because it helps take the stress off of me from making sure they are both mentally and physically enriched. So with that being said, I am going to go ahead and bring on our guest. Jim, you ready to come on? Okay, here he's coming on. I'm bringing him on screen here. Hey, Jim, how are you?
Hey, Lara, I'm great, thanks. How are you?
Good, good. Good to have you back on here again, and thanks for joining me again. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, you and I have talked via live stream several different times. You've been on Coffee with the Critters one time previously, correct?
Sure.
Yeah, and that was a great conversation. That can be found here on the Animal Behavior Center's Facebook page, and it can also be found on, we upload it to our YouTube channel. So let me do the honor and correct me if I read or say anything wrong, Jim. But I'm going to introduce you. So Jim, you're involved in a lot of things, but your bio, as I had it on this event page, for the past 7 years, Jim has worked with clients and their dogs on a wide range of behavior problems. In 2018, Jim joined a leading animal welfare charity as behavior officer, working in post-adoption support in the rescue sector. Jim uses scientific, evidence-based approaches to training and behavior modification. These include the use of the most up-to-date methods, which utilize force-free methods focusing exclusively on humane and non-aversive techniques. Jim is a qualified and certified dog trainer and behaviorist. He has significant experience in working with dogs in moderate to severe behavior issues. Following the completion of an advanced diploma in canine behavior management, he then made the step forward in offering behavioral consultations to dog owners. Jim is currently working towards a graduate diploma in animal behavior management and has recently attained certified dog behavior consultant status via IAABC.
Yep.
Good.
All good.
What's that?
That's all good. Yep.
Yep, and it sounds great. So I commend you to the work you're doing and advancing the work you're doing.
Sure.
So today, Jim, and you and I have talked about this numerous times via live stream, via private conversations together. Today, this is a topic that I think people need to understand a little bit better, to understand what they're seeing in their homes or the facilities in which they're working. We're going to discuss thresholds, a discussion about fear, frustration, and triggers. With that being said, do you want to define threshold?
Sure.
What a threshold is?
Sure.
Or what it looks like?
Yeah, sure. So a threshold is the point that must be exceeded to begin producing a given effect or result to elicit a response. So it's a line drawn to separate reactivity and non-reactivity, essentially.
Okay. Do you, I see animals pushed over threshold numerous different times. Do you have any examples in your head that you can think of right now so people can get a better understanding of what we're getting ready to talk about?
Sure. So I think starting with the more involuntary responses that you'll see, or what I call as biomarkers, some of those autonomic responses that are harder to spot, but definitely indicate over threshold responses. So that would be things like an increase in heart rate, pupil dilation, higher respiratory rate, yawning, lip licking, shaking, teeth chattering, panting, those types of involuntary responses. And then you would maybe see the kind of outward manifestation of them in behavioural terms as, potentially barking, mouthing, wagging a lead, pacing, spinning, lunging, those types of behaviours would all indicate over threshold behaviour.
Yeah, and I think it's probably important here as well to say this is individualized. What it looks like with one animal could be completely different with the next.
Absolutely. And it could also be in relation to their environment. So yes, that individual, but also their perception of the environment and changes within the environment and possible trigger stacks that are occurring within that environment. So an example of that may be, a dog that can maybe cope with one dog in isolation from a distance, but then you introduce another dog and then traffic and a wide variety of different environmental issues, and you have a trigger stack which would push that dog over threshold faster.
Okay, yeah, I have a couple different things running through my head that I'm sure we'll talk about. That's going to be hard to talk about because this is a pretty in-depth topic that's going to be hard to cover within an hour.
Sure.
But I have a podcast through our membership called Over Threshold and Overstimulation. With the animals that we work with here, first I need to identify what that overstimulation looks like, that over threshold look like. What behavior am I seeing? And you had mentioned some examples such as accelerated heartbeat.
Yeah.
And the first thing that popped into my mind is people are like, how would I know that? And in applied behavior analysis, it is working with behavior through observing observable and measurable events. And that increased heart rate is one way to measure behavior.
Absolutely. Yeah. And operationalizing that behavior, as you're intimating to, can be difficult and it can be subtle. And those changes in the biomarkers are subtle. And the earlier that handlers can spot those biomarker changes, the easier it is, or early on they can spot an over threshold response. So if you are seeing barking, lunging behavior, what we would perceive to be potentially aggressive behavior, and in an over threshold response, then there are probably quite a lot of markers that are already been missed if that dog is way over threshold. And a good way to sort of break that down would be into little zones. So if you have, for example, a green zone where normal function of behavior is occurring, the dog is its normal self, relatively calm. If you cue it for attention or focus, it would give it to you. As you cross over that dog's threshold, you tip into amber, and that's where the warning signs start to occur. And that's where you have that increase in heart rate, pupil dilation, hard staring, those types of things, difficult to break in terms of gaining focus back onto the handler. And then in the red zone, that's where you have way over threshold behavior. You have lunging, barking, snapping, biting, all those kind of aberrant behavior that we don't want to see from our dogs.
Yeah, to the point where like a dog is over threshold and it's barking, doing a lot of different behaviors that no matter how hard you try to get their attention or redirect it, you can't.
Absolutely. And also learning is pretty much compromised in there because you have autonomic activation of the stress response. So that will come with, the traditional fight or flight response, and learning will be compromised in that zone. So trying to teach a dog that's over threshold a behavior is going to be really difficult. And for them, it's likely defined as a survival event anyway, so they are in a mode where this is about survival. So being able to listen to a handler, for example, is almost impossible. And a good marker for where that dog is in relation to the threshold is to cue them for focus or train it independently and then cue them for focus. And if you can't get it, you're likely over threshold to a stressor in the environment.
So a place to begin with behaviors that we're talking about, would it be taking them into an environment where those stressors don't exist, and train them behavior and slowly introduce them to and generalize these behaviors to different areas, different situations?
Absolutely. Maybe start in your living room, train some focus, some eye contact with your dog, move that to your back garden if you have one and train it there, and then maybe go to a very quiet location outside, maybe a quieter park where you can work from a distance, and then you start to encounter stressors and triggers within the environment. And a good gauge when you're doing that is cueing that focus. And if you lose the focus and you start to see what we would call as those over threshold behaviors, that lack of focus, hypervigilance, displacement behaviors potentially, then it's likely you've crossed that threshold. And a good way to maybe test this is to set a dog up. So if we maybe use an example of one that I've got repeatedly just now, which is traffic issues, and it's a really common problem. Something that probably starts quite early on of being overexposed and being over threshold quite a lot around traffic, and then the resulting behaviour being manifested. So whether that's been overstimulated by traffic or being fearful in the presence of traffic, the behaviour which has been manifested is being reinforced in the environment. So either chasing or lunging at traffic. And a good way to counterbalance that is to work at a distance, find a location where it's really quiet, and then establish the threshold of where that dog can cope. And once you establish that threshold, you can work under that threshold to desensitize the dog, but also activate the seeking part of their brain to counterbalance negative emotion. And we spoke about that in the last webinar about using, foraging as a way to activate seeking and therefore activate the reward center of their brain, but under threshold.
Okay. When and do we want to talk about intermittent schedules of reinforcement here and how important they are when you're trying to keep an animal, work with an animal under threshold, and then somebody comes in and once in a while takes that animal beyond that threshold? Do you encounter that a lot?
Yeah, for sure. And maybe things in the environment will do that accidentally anyway, as a trigger starts to appear. So maybe working at a distance around a quiet road, and then someone with a dog comes into the periphery, and then a strange person, unfamiliar person comes in from the other side, and all of that stacks up to push the dog over threshold faster. Their perception of the environment is changing in relation to the cues within the environment and the stressors within the environment. And that's a really good example of where if you are working at a distance and all of a sudden the aberrant behaviour starts to occur again, then look around you and see what other stressors have entered into the environment which are causing that dog to flood faster or be over threshold faster.
And that's probably more common in the companion animal community because these animals are living within houses with numerous people, and whereas it's important for everybody in the household to understand what you're doing, why you're doing it, and how you're doing it.
Yeah, absolutely.
So when an unforeseen event happens that takes that animal over threshold, sometimes those events are beyond our control.
Sure.
We didn't see it coming. I know that here I will tell people I make mistakes, but when I make them, I note that I've made it and what did it look like, what happened before, how can I prevent this from happening again? So just making sure that we're learning from them.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. And for some dogs, it's really difficult to be under threshold anyway. So some are so stressed just by their journey in life that they can't be under threshold. So just going out into the wider world, causes them to be over threshold. And you see a lot of, pulling a lead, lunging at objects, lunging at traffic, lunging at unfamiliar people. And for those dogs, as we spoke about the last time, is to unpack it for those individual dogs. So they may need a stress break, for example, a cortisol holiday where they're not encountering stressors at all. And that means restriction to the house and garden. And I think in modern society, we're reluctant to do that for our dogs because we have a perception of what their needs are. And potentially that's out of sync with reality. And it's doing more damage overexposing them and sensitizing them to triggers as opposed to giving them a break entirely, let their body come back to homeostasis, and then start to gradually expose them to stressors in the environment. That would be a much more effective technique for a dog that is chronically stressed, for example.
Yeah, and that just reminds me of something we were doing with the lemurs here recently. And we were, so it doesn't matter whether it was lemurs, whatever the animal that we're working with. I'm like, I could tell they were really cautious of what was going on in the environment. And I can tell by how fast their head moves, the position of their tail, what's coming out of their mouth. So I learned this: when do these behaviors happen? When don't these behaviors happen? What else is happening in the environment at the same time these behaviors are happening? Those are all cues to me that maybe this animal is not as comfortable as I thought it was.
So cross-transferable, that's such a good point. It's so cross-transferable to dogs, because if you're seeing hypervigilance, or if you're feeling grabby, taking off food, where normally they're calm and they'll take them gently, and they're grabbing food out of your hand and you're getting hypervigilant head movements, then likely that dog is over threshold to a stressor and flooding, for sure.
Yeah.
For sure.
So what I was, in this particular instance, I was seeing them turning and looking over their head. So this is observable, measurable behavior. And this was starting to, it was maintaining. So I was like, what is reinforcing it? What's happening in the environment? And so I just suggested to the other trainer, just let the animal go, cue them out, and watch what their behavior looks like outside of a training session. And then once a training session begins again. And I always tell people, like, I'm really, target training can be your best friend in understanding that particular animal. And a lot of times, like, body language is behavior. What behavior is happening from this animal? And that's how, even if I'm working with a species, Jim, that I may not be as familiar with, which I love to do because it really helps me fine tune what exactly am I looking at. I will begin, if I can, with the target. Teach a nose target over here, over here. What does this mean? What does showing the teeth mean? So when you're working with a dog, say you're going to start working with a client with an animal on, we were just talking about this right before, which I said, let's bring this up during the live stream. Documentation of what over threshold looks like. We were talking about how both of us agreed we don't intentionally put an animal in that position to document what it looks like before and after.
Sure. It's so difficult because ethically you don't want to put a client or their dog in that situation for ethical reasons, but also we don't want rehearsal of unwanted behaviour. It's the whole point of sub-threshold training, is that you're preventing the rehearsal. And sometimes in behaviour modification, that's the most important thing, is preventing rehearsal. As you intimate, it's the operational of the behaviour which is the issue. It's the reinforcement which is coming from the environment. So if a dog is lunging at traffic, then and if they're overexposed to traffic, then their behaviour is being reinforced every time that they're out on a walk. And it just makes it so much more difficult. But to get a before and after for us is really challenging from that point of view, because we wouldn't put our clients in that position in the first place.
Yeah, right, exactly. Like we were talking about, we had also mentioned that if I'm looking for an example of a positive punisher, I'm not going to intentionally introduce it in the environment.
Sure.
I have found, like working with Pocahontas, the African crested porcupine, the camera is usually always going every time I start a training session, or even before I start a training session. I will record the animal in its environment without me, or with me at a distance. And I have been able to, like with Pocahontas, I was able to, when the animal first came here, I wasn't exactly sure what this behavior was. So I was recording it and watching at a distance. And then I was able to see, after several days of working with it, that behavior, what I was originally looking at, was maybe overstimulation, over threshold.
Yeah.
So let's see. I think a lot of people, when they're working with behaviors, and I'm watching everybody's comments, when they're working with behaviors as overstimulated or over threshold, I think many people don't even know exactly what they're looking at.
Sure. And even for professionals, it can be difficult to disseminate between a fear-based response and frustration-elicited behaviour or overstimulated behaviour. But you might find if it is overstimulated behaviour, it's more about the lifestyle of that dog. And again, we spoke about this in the last time about overstimulating a dog continually and then going out for a walk and encountering a stressor. And that dog's already overstimulated, potentially in a state of hyperarousal, which, as we know, is a stress condition as opposed to anything else, and misinterpreted by the owners, and that dog is manifesting the hyperarousal. It has to go somewhere, right? That arousal has to channel itself somewhere, and what you're seeing is a lot of what we would classify as aberrant behaviour, and over threshold behaviour, because potentially that dog can't be under threshold because of the way it's living its life. So lots of point A to point B walking, 10 kilometres a day walking, on repetitively chasing after a ball with no completion of that cycle. We spoke about this the last time, which is definitely an interesting way of looking at it. And then they take that dog for a walk and they encounter stressors, and that dog can't be under threshold because of its physiological state.
And I know there's studies out there on this, on the effects of consistent stressors on the body in the animal's environment.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so a couple of things I'm writing down as you're talking. When you think you see these behaviors from an animal, I always tell people, get in touch with a professional as soon as possible, because the longer this behavior happens, the more it's being reinforced.
The harder it is to treat, for sure.
Yeah,
for sure. And don't wait until something really bad happens, because the legal costs of that would outweigh, hiring a behaviourist to resolve it early on. So don't wait until you have a situation where you're at crisis point to contact a professional, spot it early on, recognise there's a potential issue, and then take steps to address that early on. Will save you in the longer term, for sure.
Sure, and make your animal's life better quality of life for the animal, and for the people taking care of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe a guide or a marker to give people some information and maybe what they're looking at when they see some of these problem behaviours from our dogs is the level of the emotional response from a dog. So some dogs will simply learn to respond in this way. So maybe started off being overstimulated or worried about a stressor, and then they learn to respond in a specific way. So there's not much going on from an emotional point of view. They're learning to bark at a stressor, for example, or lunge at them, but they're perfectly calm. There's no state of arousal really, and they're learning to respond in that way, and they're being reinforced in the environment. It's a very operant behaviour versus a dog that's really stressed and really worried in a state of distress. Those are slightly different, albeit the only thing that will probably change is the threshold. So a threshold for that dog will probably be further away from a stressor because of the level of emotional response, versus a dog that is relatively calm, well looked after, doesn't have any other problem behaviour, but has learned to respond in a specific way to a trigger.
Yes. I've got a lot of things written down that I want to just discuss with you.
Sure.
There is a particular stressor that a lot of people don't understand, that it is a sign of a stressor in the environment, and that is defecation.
Oh yeah. Oh, yeah.
I know, like, somebody I had talked to said every time somebody comes to the front door, the dog runs to the back of the couch and defecates. And I was just like, that is something you need to be paying attention to.
Definitely.
This behavior, and this person was saying it happens for no reason. I was like, it is happening. That is a very clear sign of
sure.
I had asked about what else is happening in the environment. So there's the trigger. Where do you begin? Do you see, I know here with the lemurs, if that lemur defecates, now it defecates in numerous different situations, but if it's defecating during a training session, that is a sign. Pay attention. This animal is, we're pushing this animal too far, too fast.
Absolutely. And inappropriate elimination in general. So urinating as well would be a good marker for, acute stress response to a stressor. And we see this quite a lot in, dogs that are really worried about a stressor will just evacuate, bowels and bladder. And that's that mobilization, it's the arousal mobilization of the involuntary system. And it does indicate over threshold to a stressor in the environment. But those stressors can sometimes be difficult to unpack. And because of the higher order conditioning, where there are predictors predicting a negative event with a stressor, a doorbell, door chapping, that type of thing, it will take on a similar value or the same value as the stressor itself. So when they hear that cue, that brings on those same emotions are felt, and therefore you get those involuntary responses. And those are sometimes more difficult to identify, which is why it needs unpacked. And that can be easily to like a leader harness that is predicting going out for a walk and encountering a stressor. And you're actually seeing problem behaviour as soon as the harness is brought out. I've got this with several cases just now where it's just not been spotted by the owner. And understandably so, we can't expect people to understand that right off the bat. But when you explain it to them, you can see that worry and you can see the conditioning taking place in the harness, and we can start there, we can unpack it for the dog so that they feel a bit more in control, a bit calmer by the time they go out for a walk, and avoiding stressors would be a really good thing for that particular individual
dog. Yeah, I'm trying to figure out, because as you're talking about this, over threshold can be, and tell me if I'm incorrect, Jim. Behaviors related to being over threshold aren't necessarily always just stressors, aversives, correct?
Sure.
Like here, I can get an animal that is overstimulated through something it's excited to interact with.
Absolutely, 100%. Yeah, and actually that is quite a difficult one for dog owners when they see their dog lunging at other dogs, as they misinterpret that as defensive aggression, where in reality they're so frustrated that they want to go and have that social interaction. It's so reinforcing to have those social interactions that the barrier of the leash has become such a frustrating thing for them. On site, they'll learn to lunge at that dog, but the motivation is distinctly different. And what I would say is that motivation is either distance increasing or distance decreasing. If you're seeing distance decreasing behaviour, it's likely the perception of the trigger is a positive one. It's just you're seeing a lot of frustration. But if it's distance increasing behaviour, then you're seeing fear, you're seeing defensive aggression. And an attempt to create distance from that trigger would be something I would identify as fear-based.
Yeah, a couple of different, like as we're talking, I'm trying to think of different examples. I have two. One with a parrot and one with two dogs that I can't, both my dogs that I can put into play here. Overstimulation, over threshold, my bird Rico comes into mind. So there was a point where, every behavior happens for a reason.
Sure.
There was a point where he gets overexcited about just me walking into his enclosure can lead to a bite.
Sure.
And that can be easily labeled as aggression, and it's not.
Yeah.
So anything that shows excitement about interacting with, he can easily bite, which is why he is pretty much off contact here for anybody that's not familiar with this.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
We do have Lindsay Douglas. She is working on getting into his cage, because just somebody coming into his cage, you have to know what you're doing, how to deal with this, what's your training approach, because he can easily fly down and give a pretty nasty bite. Okay. And but what would happen is, I noticed some things that were happening. If he was on my hand and I'm walking around the center and I go to pick up something, bam, I found out that, okay, this behavior has happened twice now. that it was overstimulation about whatever I was picking up. If he sees, a lot of our time here is spent making enrichment, and he sees us bring in these foraging toys that I can tell by his behavior, he's very excited to start interacting with it. And if I go up and hand it to him, if I hand it to him like this, where his beak can't reach me, but if I were to hand it to him like this, where here he is and his beak can reach me, I'm likely going to get bitten. So I took a series of steps, and I am now able to grab a toy, grab a ladder, walk into his enclosure, set up the ladder, go over, pick him up, pick up the toy, climb the ladder, hang it while he's all sitting here on my hand. But that has taken a series of steps for me to get to that point. And I begin where he's under threshold and reinforce behavior under threshold that I want to see maintain or increase. Reinforce any signs of calm behavior as I'm slowly shaping my behavior of adding that item of excitement into his environment.
Sure. How much easier is it when he is under threshold to teach those replacement behaviours? It's just so much more effective. And that's where the skill comes in, is being able to identify that threshold so that you can then work underneath it and train those replacement behaviours. But what I would say is that particularly dogs that are overstimulated will meet their aggression threshold much faster. And that's something to look out for when you're working with a dog, is if they are overstimulated and frustrated, that can quickly escalate to aggression. And frustration elicited aggression, which is different from fear-based defensive aggression, as we know. And when they meet that, they'll meet it much faster, and you may see that tap into that anger, rage part of the brain. And anybody who wants to look into that further, let's check out Yak Pansett and his talk on emotions, which is fantastic, really interesting, because we know they have those primordial systems, and if they're in that state where they're overstimulated and then frustrated, look out for redirected aggression all over the place. That might not be just onto you. It could start off with ragging the lead, it could start off with mouthing, but then it could quickly escalate into biting quite quickly. And you maybe see that across species as well with animals you work with.
Yes. I was thinking in particular to animals, this is a situation that had happened about probably 6 months ago. We have multiple species here. A lot of individualized rooms. We're constantly moving, shifting animals. That's why it's important to teach a station, because if I'm teaching a dog a station here and I move a pig right in front of them, if it's not well trained, I'm going to lose control of that dog, and the pig is not going to end up well. Yeah. So these behaviors start with lots of distance, individualized rooms, so we can safely shift and move animals around here. Our dogs were out in the training room, and it was Levi, our deaf bulldog. I was standing in the training room and sitting there talking, and all of a sudden I heard a bark and a smash. And I turned around to look to see what it was. And it was, we have a door with a window, and an animal of a different species passed in front of that window, and Levi saw it and ran up and threw his body weight up against the door. Wow. And barked. And I looked, and I was just like, what was that? Because I heard the behavior, but I didn't see it. Mm-hmm. And I said, what was that? And they're like, some of the volunteers are like, oh, that's happened a couple of times. And I was just like, I need to be made aware of this.
Yeah, sure.
Because the longer this happens, the stronger it's going to get, the more it's being reinforced. And God forbid a day ever or an accident ever happened where that door wasn't there. That animal crossing in front of that window is in serious trouble.
Yeah, definitely. Wow. Yeah.
So when we have a question from a viewer, do you want to address it? Okay. So it's Melissa, who is working with 2 dogs. I've been to her house working with her 2 dogs. There is overstimulation, over threshold there. She says, how do you tell the difference between fear-based aggression and over threshold excited aggression if they are both lunging, biting, attacking?
Sure.
That's a good question.
Yeah, it's a great question as well. And it can be difficult in terms of identifying those motivations because we can't get inside the dog to find out exactly what's going on, but there will be the associated body language markers to look out for. So, what are you seeing in terms of tail action, body posture, those types of things? Where is it happening? What context is it happening under? What are the triggers? So is it redirected frustration elicited aggression, that type of thing? Is it a trigger which is causing that behaviour? Or is it a relationship issue between the two dogs? You know, are they competing for a resource? Are they in an environment which isn't suitable for them? So there's a lot of factors to kind of unpack there. But generally, what I'll look for is, you know, the body postures. You know, is a tail tucked or is it up and you know, wagging fast? Are the dogs in a state of arousal, and do they seem like they are trying to decrease distance to each other and can't for whatever reason? So if it is a relationship issue, then that's something that could be fostered out with that context. But the context of that would be really important.
Yeah, and some of the things that it's with her two dogs. I had asked her, when do these behaviors happen? When aren't they happening? What are the cues, the triggers in the environment? Watch for those situations where it's likely to happen.
Yeah.
And then what do you want the dog to do instead?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I did a functional assessment on that. And there's a great resource that I can post after this by Susan Friedman. It's called a FADE form, which is a functional assessment form, which will give you all the answers to those questions. And it's the what, where, whys, and hows of the behaviour. And then it gives you a roadmap to work through to replacement behaviours and identifying the triggers and dealing with them. So if it is a trigger that's dealing with that, then I would deal with the trigger as opposed to worrying about the aggression as such. I would deal with that trigger so that it's not provoking a response from either dog. But it would really be about the context of that aggression would be really important. But sometimes it's really difficult to disseminate. But if you are working with, say, like an individual dog, and they have either like sort of lunging behaviour at other dogs or barking, then from my point of view, if I'm working under threshold, it might not matter that much whether it's overstimulation or fear-based. It's important that we diagnose it and we're quite precise in terms of how we identify it. But from a treatment point of view, it might not matter that much if I'm doing systemic desensitization, as long as I'm working under that animal's threshold. So maybe let me give you a setup for an individual dog that will maybe help if we can do that. So maybe if you have a quiet area, you can take, you know, one dog in isolation with a handler off in a distance, and you're working with, you know, your problem dog, is work with that dog to find out, train the focus training as we spoke about earlier, use that as your cue. Any operant behaviour will do. So you could do like a hand touch or focus or really any operant behaviour. Work with that operant behaviour to establish the threshold. So work to the point where operant behaviour is no longer being displayed, and then back up. So as soon as you find that threshold, as soon as you see some of those biomarkers that we spoke about earlier, you know, hard stare, freezing, you know, potentially sort of yawning, lip licking, all of the signs of stress, back up a few meters and then start to work with the foraging that we spoke about in the last webinar. Get that dog seeking, tap into the reward center of their brain, and it will counterbalance back some of those negative emotions. Then over time, you start to really gradually reduce the distance. And that's where the gradual exposure therapy will really come into its own if you can identify that threshold. And that may work for those two dogs depending on what's triggering the aggression.
Yeah, we have another question too, and both of these are coming from level 1 members. And I just want to just to let you guys know, I don't think you guys know this yet, but Jim and I have talked about this. Jim is going to be coming into level 1 as a guest talking about threshold, and you're also coming into level 2 to talk about a few different individual cases that we can really dive into. Because Jude is asking a question. One of the things I suggest, like a lot of people, when they do understand, they have recognized the triggers, they know what the behavior looks like, they know when it's likely to happen. Don't forget, what do you want them to do instead? What would you like as the replacement issue or behavior? And I know with Melissa, we had worked on with distance stations. You see that a certain time is coming. Triggers are likely to happen at this particular time. Cue them to their station. High rates of reinforcement. And this all starts not when the trigger is getting ready to happen. It starts, like you said in the beginning, in the calm, comfortable environment of your living room, where we can start training.
Sure, just to touch back on that, that's a specific question. Inter-household dog aggression is probably one of the more complex cases. There's so many triggers in a home environment that can predict aggression for two dogs, and it needs to be kind of unpacked on that way. But having like a positive interrupter and then station training is a really well-established approach to those issues, where you have a cue which simply interrupts the dog for focus and then redirect to station, and that's a really effective way to deal with inter-household dog aggression. But safety and is probably the top priority, depending on how far they're escalating. So having some physical barriers in place might be a good idea. You know, having station training behind the baby gate, for example, where you can interrupt, immediately redirect to station, close the baby gate, and everybody's safe and everything can de-escalate. And that's a nice way of dealing with that situation for sure.
Yeah. We had a puppy in, a 35-pound puppy in for training last week. She told me, so we were in a separate room, and she said, one of the things I want to work on is as soon as somebody comes to the door, this puppy starts barking, and as soon as the person comes in, jumping uncontrollably. So I cued Lindsay through the window, come in here in a couple of minutes. Let me work with this dog first. So one of the things I did was I said, what do you use as reinforcers for desired behavior? Regardless, I asked Lindsay to cut up some hot dog bits. So this is a treat that the dog wasn't getting, and I tested to see how high value it was. I determined it was a high value. So then I did some real quick recall with the dog, and then reinforcing, looking at me. Because if you're looking at me, not only can you hear me give you guidance for the next thing I want you to do, but you're reading what I'm asking you to do. So then I cued Lindsay to come in, and I watched her, and right before her hand hit that doorknob, I was just like, boom, boom, boom. So it was high rates of reinforcement in the beginning in my shaping plan.
Yeah.
And what I was watching for was eye contact. And if the dog looked away from me, when it would look back at me, boom, boom, boom. So there was the size of the reinforcer. And Lindsay was able to walk in and walked completely around us. And this dog just kept looking at me for more hot dogs coming. One of the many things I suggested to her then was train this before somebody, and train him to go to a station before the situation comes, walking in the door.
Sure, absolutely. In this case, actually, I get this case quite a lot, but I've actually got one active case which is identical to that situation. And the way we deconstructed it was about, yes, dealing with the triggers, but maybe dealing with the triggers in a way which reduces their value first of all. So desensitize them to the trigger, counter condition it, and then replacement behaviour. And what we have is a nice little unpacked of a very structured approach to dealing with that problem. So the trigger no longer has its value because we've desensitized it. Now we've counter conditioned it, we have our conditioned emotional response in play. Now we're doing replacement behaviour, we're straight to station training. So the dog hears a cue, straight to mat and downs and stays. Sounds great, takes quite a lot of training that for sure, but that's about sort of breaking that down into segments so that we're dealing with the trigger first of all, so that it's not as salient as it used to be. But you can definitely do your example as well, where you're differentially reinforcing eye contact, and that would definitely be effective as well for sure.
Something you just said reminded me of something. Because triggers are cues.
Yeah.
Triggers are sound signals, sights, whatever, that are paired with something else. So that animal has learned that in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely.
Those triggers, those cues have been learned. So when, Jim, you're sitting here talking about desensitizing and counter conditioning, this is very important because these triggers were knowingly or unknowingly learned in the first place.
Absolutely. And salient as well, very powerful triggers. Some of these, particularly a doorbell or a door chapping, well-established trigger, well-practiced behaviour over time. I think this dog was 6 years of practiced behaviour. So to just go straight to replacement behaviour, you might find tough, unless you've got something of really significant value to offer that dog, i.e. hot dogs, cheese, something really powerful. Even then, you're still going to get remnants of that learning history. And what we need to bear in mind is that type of agonistic behaviour is quite addictive to dogs. It's quite fun to bark at the door if you're a dog. You get that rush of cortisol and adrenaline, and it feels good to do it, which is probably why they do it in the first place. But probably be in relation to a perceived threat. So what we can do is maybe reduce the value of that first of all, just to speed up the replacement behaviour, replacement activity. I did it with my dog Floyd, where he hears the door now, he runs to his bed and stations, and it's a lovely behaviour. It took about a year with him, if I'll be honest with you. It took a long time. He had a lot of other problem behaviour, so he's not a great example. But this particular dog, and I think I love the way you put that with these triggers are just cues for behaviour. And I love that view of it, because that's exactly what it is. And dogs are such fast learners that they are practicing unwanted behaviour, they're optimizing their behaviour under those conditions to these cues. And I think that's a really good way of looking at it. And they're such fast at learning that some dogs are so good at responding in this way because that's how they've learned to do it. And what we need to do is try and counterbalance that back with another replacement behaviour. And that can sometimes be really challenging, depending on how long it's been practiced for.
Yeah. Yes. In talking about replacement behaviors and cues, so when you have a dog that barks at strangers walking across the street, when you're talking about using distance and counter conditioning, desensitizing, so increasing that distance when the person is a block and a half down the street, bridge, reinforce, bridge, reinforce. And soon as your training and time continues, that person walking across the street is now going to be a cue to look at you for your reinforcer versus the barking.
Yeah, you've rewired the way that kind of neural pathways from that behaviour. You kind of rewired it from the dog's perspective. I'll have two different operant behaviours under those conditions. Focus training for eye contact for sure, and then the go find the game to redirect. So it's usually make eye contact with me and a handful of treats in the forage or whatever that's near to you. So you're breaking the cycle and the pattern of repeating behaviour, which is unwanted, and you're redirecting away with the go find the game. The added benefit of that go find the game is the sniffing behaviour, which has been shown recently to lower heart rate, pulse rate, calm the dog down. So you're getting that added benefit. Plus, you've got an operant behaviour which you can reward and therefore get that conditioned emotional response. And if you're doing that properly, that will have a really great desired effect for most dogs that you're working with, for sure.
Yeah, and I could give another example, but we have another question or two. We'll be able to take at least one. But Christy says threshold therapy and shaping calm sound like the same thing. This is what you were talking about in the live stream. Jim, I talk a lot about reinforced calm behaviors. That's what Christy's talking about. Would you consider that the same as what you're talking about with the threshold therapy?
Yeah, pretty much. I think calm behaviour in dogs can be difficult territory because of behavioural inhibition and levels of stress, depending on the situation that they're in. We can misinterpret calm behaviour for being suppression of behaviour, and we need to be careful there. But in general, yeah, sub-threshold, a dog is going to be calm. They're their normal self. They're sniffing the ground. You're cueing them for operant behaviour, and they're giving it to you all over the place. That's what I would see as calm behaviour. There's no signs of acute or chronic stress, and that's probably what I would operationalise calm as being. I think it's quite a difficult one for us, though, to put conditions around calm behaviour, because I don't think we'll ever know for sure and internally within a dog. But we can hypothesise and then test and then retest. So yes, I would answer that question by saying if a dog's under threshold, they're likely to be calm, albeit that can be difficult.
Yeah, and you just mentioned something so extremely important is, do you really know what it looks like in or is undesired behavior actually being suppressed?
Totally. Or is it a construct? So same with arousal, albeit I do believe arousal is a physiological and psychological state. I think it is measurable, it's hard to do. But it is also quite a bit of a construct, and we need to be careful of those labels that we apply to dogs, just in case we get it wrong and we think that dog's calm, but in reality they are under such stress and duress, the behaviour's just been inhibited.
Yes. And I want to give an example, and it's not one I've seen, but it's one I've heard. It is something I've seen under certain situations. But if you're using aversives to control behavior, that is something I stay as far away from as possible, especially with some of the species I work with, because you can get hurt or killed very quickly. So when you're talking about suppressing behavior, I wanted to bring this point up real quick, Jim, that if, for example, you're working with a dog using an aversive to control behavior, such as the dog, there's triggers that the dog is not comfortable, and you jerk the leash to tell them to stop. Yeah. If it is a child approaching that is causing this dog to behave in a way that you're jerking the leash to control behavior, now that's paired with that child getting closer and closer, you could have a very dangerous encounter getting ready to happen.
Oh yeah, I've got a great example of that where the trainer was using a shock collar, and an unfamiliar person was approaching that dog, and they're shocking the dog for unwanted behaviour, and then by the time the person came way over threshold, so the dog is trying to communicate distance increase in behaviour. It's trying to say with its body language, "Stay away from me, you scare me," and the trainer's suppressing all that behaviour to the point that they're in red zone, and I mean from the threshold point of view, and then when the dog got the opportunity, it bit that person really badly, and it's a terrible situation. So it's never something we use because it's ineffective. If it just suppresses behaviour, it doesn't change anything. It just suppresses that particular response. It will manifest itself in other ways, particularly in more dangerous ways.
Yeah, and maybe I'm wrong in comparing this situation, but I do like to compare some human situations just so it helps people understand what they may be looking at with their animal. It's like to the point where somebody keeps touching me or bugging me or otherwise instigating me, something like this, to get regardless what it is, something is happening and my behavior is being suppressed, and all of a sudden I just blow up and stop it.
Yeah, exactly. Good example, Lara. Yeah, good example.
Yeah. So Jim, we have a couple more questions. We're coming up on the hour. We've got 2 minutes. I do like to keep this at an hour. And some of the questions are coming from our members. So Jude, I will be having Jim in because I know Jude is having some concerns with her dogs. And Mary, yes, please rewatch this. Jim will also be coming into our level 2 membership. And then Jim, once this live stream is done, if you want to go back and look through people's comments.
Yeah, and if you have any specific questions, feel free to contact me directly, particularly about, your dogs or dogs that you're working with. Feel free to contact me. No problem at all.
So people can reach you, Jim, if they want to reach you by email. Your email is, there's your email address, cbtdogbehavior@gmail.com. And your website, the same, cbtdogbehavior.com. You can also find Jim on Facebook at CBD Dog Behavior. Jim, I appreciate you coming on here again.
Pleasure as always.
It's always great talking to you. You're brain candy for me.
Thank you. Thoroughly enjoy it as well, so thanks for having me on. It's much appreciated.
Yeah. Thank you. So you guys, you'll be seeing Jim more. I'm sure I'd love to have you on in 2020 again. As a guest here on Coffee with the Critters.
For sure.
You'll see him in level 1 and level 2 as soon as Jim and I get those scheduled. With that being said, happy holidays, everybody. Pay attention to the upcoming live streams we have for Coffee with the Critters. We have we're starting to book into March of 2020. If you like the content you have seen here, the information, the science of in the behavior, take a look at our website, theanimalbehaviorcenter.com. Our level 1 membership, our memberships are annual memberships. Level 1 is more for companion animals. Level 2 is more for people thinking about getting in the field of animal behavior training or wanting more information. We also have our species-specific memberships, deaf dog, parrot, pig. Also, keep in mind, if you have an animal lover on your list, including yourself for the holidays, take a look at our services, and we have a wide variety of products to services available in addition to gift vouchers in any amount. There's a gift voucher example that we give. You can find those on our website at theanimalbehaviorcenter.com in our referral program. For every 5 people you refer to our services, our memberships or projects that sign up earns you a 1-hour free consultation. Take a look at our workshops on our website. We have 2 zoo workshops coming up in June that as soon as we open registration, I know we'll sell out very quickly. With that being said, thank you, everybody. And Jim, thanks again.
Really pleasure.
Talk to you.
Talk to you soon.
All right. Take care.
Bye, everyone. Bye.